Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be doing our first ever top 10 list. And this is actually a very interesting topic that I have thought of, I feel like. Everybody always talks about like a top 10 best Survivor winners or a top 10 best runner-up or something like that. But an interesting idea that I came up with by somebody in the Discord server of the Survivor Gumball channel is actually the idea of the top 10 worst players to make the finale. Or, moreover, top 10 worst players to make Final Tribal Council. This accounts for both the winners and the runners up. So let's get into the top 10 here, starting out with number 10, who is the very first runner up in the show's history. I have Kelly Wigglesworth. And Kelly Wigglesworth is just a very tough player to assess, I feel like, because of just the strong personality shift that it seemed like happened with her post game. Well, not post game, but in the post merge, where she was essentially throughout most of the pre merge working alongside the core Tagi Alliance, which was of course Richard, Sue, herself, and Rudy, to vote out players like Dirk. They got out Stacy this way, and she was able to coast very far into the game up until the Jenna Lewis vote. She was pretty resolute in this group. However, she then decides to flip and be the sole player to flip in the Jervis vote, is not able to have the numbers, and as such is now just on the bottom throughout the rest of her game, needing to win immunity after immunity to get to the end in a spot where she really didn't even have that strong of win equity. It didn't seem like people really loved Kelly Wigglesworth out there on the island, and Rich was just simply a lot more respected. She does come very close to a win. She was one vote away, but she was never really getting that vote, and it was supposedly supposed to be an even worse vote. So I just simply don't think that there is a ton redeeming about Kelly Wentworth. Not Kelly Wentworth. I don't think that there's a ton redeeming about Kelly Wigglesworth's game here, aside from the fact that she was in a majority alliance, which is going to be a bit of a trend with some of the players lower on the list. But as you'll see, we'll get there later. Next up, I have one of the few winners to make this at number 9. I'm going with Judd Fabio Bza. And yeah, Fabio is also not a very good player. I think that he's like a competent enough player, but his game on this season was not very strong. He was initially in the alliance with Shannon, which obviously gets flipped on in the first vote, voting for Brenda, starting his sort of aloof streak where he just doesn't really know what's going on for most of the game. He's in the majority upon the post swap, but that's mostly just due to the fact that his tribe had the number. Comes into the merge, ends up siding with Marty's group, ends up losing Marty, and the main thing that makes Fabio's game really bad to me is the double quit. Not necessarily because the double quit does anything to Fabio specifically himself, but more so what the double quit represents. It makes him have to, for one thing, go past 2 rounds in which likely it would have been, I would imagine, Dan and Benry getting voted out there, which would have left Fabio alone. I do suspect Fabio would have been the last remaining of that group, but even still, it's not an impressive thing to be the bottom of a minority alliance, really. And even within that, Fabio just simply didn't have the strategic acumen to really ever get himself out of that. He does get benefited heavily by that by getting able to skip 2 rounds of gameplay, automatically jumping him to Final 7. They try to flip over Sash, ultimately failing getting his loyalty, and Benry is voted out for simply being viewed as a bigger threat. And from that point on, he's just sort of able to comp out, which in terms of a player ranking is cool. It shows that he's very competent in those challenges that he wins, and they're fairly diverse challenges, all things considered, so that is good for him. But as it stands, he only wins sort of due to people really liking him socially, which you can attribute as a good factor to him, but you also just need to account for the fact that he really shouldn't have even been there in the first place. I don't think that Fabio's game is very good. He has minor benefits to it, and he's really only this low on the list because, well, he does win, so that is fairly impressive, being able to, win a jury vote, but it's just not a very strong game in my opinion, so that's what leaves him there at number 9. At number 8, I have a bit of an infamous figure in Survivor history, somebody who I would imagine most people would have anticipated to be a lot lower. I'm going with Philip Shepard. Now, the main thing that keeps Philip Shepard this low on the list is he was in the majority for pretty much the entire season, actually. I mean, at the start, he wasn't technically within the majority alliance due to not immediately being combined with the he wasn't immediately locked in with Rob, trying to do stuff with Christina and Francesca, but ultimately ends up flipping and then just sort of becomes Boston Rob's sort of right hand man. Obviously, Natalie Tenorelli was his primary ally, but he always had Philip sort of there backing up all his plans. And while Philip wasn't really able to enact anything and it was all Rob, you do have to give Philip some credit, I feel like, in that. Although a lot of it probably was just Rob viewing Philip as an easy goat. Philip is one of the worst social players in Survivor history, I think. The biggest example of which being the Rice Wars situation, which is just really not flattering to see. And really, there isn't much more to say by that. There isn't anything there. Philip was always in the majority in the game, but he was never actively making moves, actively doing anything to position himself better. And due to his poor social play, he was never actually going to win the game. He was assessed as a GOAT from very early on and was just simply never able to shake that perception. I give Philip credit. He was able to get Ralph's vote. That's kind of neat, but I think that was mostly an anti-Rob vote as opposed to a pro-Philip vote. And even at the end of the day, Philip was in the majority mostly due to being a GOAT. I don't think that his game is overtly impressive in any way, but I also think it's tough to really assess him super low. So he does land at number 8 on this list due to that. At number 7, I have the first of a couple new era runners-up. I'm going with Owen. Owen is somebody who I wanted to do well. I really like Owen. I think he's a very rootable and cool guy. I think his biggest issue is just he was pretty much always on the outs. He was the primary target for the women in round 1. Ultimately, didn't end up going out because they slipped on Mariah. After that point, was never really solidly in a group, was more than likely going to be, at the very least, targeted had that tribe ever gone back, although it more than likely would have fallen back on Ellie, I imagine. And beyond that point, Owen just throughout the post-merge is the Charlie Brown figure of the season. He's never really solidly within a majority and is just sort of being dragged through by either winning immunity or just simply not being viewed as a big threat. And he ends up in the endgame in this alliance with Gabler and Cassidy, which is probably his best case scenario. But even within that, he gets 0 jury votes. It's just a very frustrating game because I think Owen has a lot of potential. I think he's a type of player that if he were to play again, he could be a very, very deadly player. However, I just simply think the game that he played on this season is really lackluster. And it does upset me because I like Owen, but I simply think he played a really bad game. And that's why he's at number 7. This is a fun one. At number 6, I have the worst winner in Survivor history. I have Bob Crowley. I genuinely considered putting Bob lower. But the thing that puts Bob this high on the list is something that nobody else on this list ever had. Bob, well, technically one person had it, but not really. Bob was in the majority alliance on his on his pre-swap tribe. Bob was somebody who was in the Onion Alliance. He was the very outer layer of it and was pretty much always going to be the first boot unless he had won immunity from that group, which is very bad already because in his group, he was going against Charlie and Corinne and Marcus, who probably would have beat him in most challenges. Unlike, Kenny and Maddie, who are fine. But yeah, it's just like Bob's positioning in the game is never very strong. He's always either at the bottom of whatever group he's in, or he's simply never in a group, which is the case for most of the endgame, in which he is just dead man walking, constantly winning immunity. And even within that, he's not playing great. And he's really only really able to win the season because he's old. And he reminds Sugar of her recently passed father. Which, I guess you can give him credit for, but, not really. And even within that, he gets to a jury vote against the worst final tribal grouping in all of Survivor history, Susie and Sugar, who are both in the bottom half of all finalists, because I ranked every finalist to make this list, and they are all bad, but Bob somehow wins in a 4-3 vote against Susie, who, spoiler alert, is lower on this list. He should have won handily, but he almost loses and only wins because Susie was worse with her active player Randy. Bob plays a really awful game on this season and is only this high on this list because he was in a majority. And even then, he was at the bottom. Bob has a really bad game, but somehow he's only number 6. Number 5, I have the next New Era player. I actually expected him to be even lower. I think this player has kind of been forgotten about in just how bad of a game that he played. And that's Romeo. Romeo is kind of like an understatedly bad player, I think. I will give Romeo this. His pre-merge is genuinely pretty solid. He's able to run most of his pre-merge with Drea. However, it's not hard to dominate the pre-merge in the New Era. Tribes are so small and there's such blatant targets. And even within that, Romeo doesn't get his way at the first vote. Romeo wants to save Zach and is unable to do so, which is already a knock. The Swathi vote goes by fine. They're able to get her out. But as soon as the merge hits, it just seems like Drea drops Romeo at pretty much immediate. And something may have been said post-swap, but I mean, it's kind of surprising that Drea is just so easy to get rid of him. And within that, Romeo is just consistently on the bottom throughout most of the rest of the pre-merge, the post-merge. When people like Chanel are going out, when we lose like Tori and Roxroy and High, Romeo really doesn't get any footing in the game and isn't being taken out because he's just such a blatant non-factor. And the one thing that I guess you can give Romeo credit for is the Omer boot. But for one thing, that was Marianne's move. And for another thing, it wasn't even Marianne's move initially. It was Jonathan's move. And it was only able to go through via Marianne's vote, extra vote, which wouldn't have happened in most given scenarios. At Final 5, he of course has the really just like nothing move of him playing a fake idol. So, sure. And he wins Final Immunity, kind of recognizing that he was going to get voted out. And just sort of takes Marianne wanting her to win over Mike or Jonathan, in which they do end up winning. Romeo was just consistently not performing very well throughout the season. He's somebody who lacked any real win equity, and just as honestly as I can put it, just had no real standing in the game post-merge, hence why he's number 5 on this list. Number 4 is another funny one. I think another player who people know is like a bad one, but I don't really hear her talked about in that light very much, because I just don't hear people talk about her anymore, and that's a Nora from Island of the Idols. Nora, kind of like the prototype for what Carolyn would later be, is just such a kooky character. She's lovely. I really liked watching her in Island of the Idols. She's one of the few bright spots that season. However, her game is abysmal. She's immediately outcasted on her initial tribe with Jason. However, they are able to be pulled into the majority for the Molly boot. However, I think that was more so them just needing them for numbers as opposed to truly wanting to work with them, as is later seen whenever we get into the post-swap. And Nora's technically in the majority here, but it's more so based upon tribal lines and Karishma flipping to get out Tom Laidlaw. So I can't really benefit her much in that. She survives the following vote, but once again, that's mostly due to tribal lines, and even then, she's like roped in on the plan to get Jack out, but more so just because Kelly wanted to make a big move, so she made a big move. That wasn't even good for her game. And then we get into the post-merge, in which Nora, like all these players, is just consistently on the bottom and out of the majority. And I give Nora credit. At the final 8, she does almost pull off a very impressive move in trying to take Tommy out. And that is one thing I do give Nora credit for, is she is always actively playing and actively trying to strategize. The issue, however, is, well, for one, she's not that good of a strategic player. And for 2, she's just never able to execute anything because nobody takes her seriously in the game. And as evidenced by just how easily Tommy's able to manipulate her in the end game. There's absolutely no reason why that fire-making challenge shouldn't have been Tommy versus Lauren. This is at a point where the fire-making challenge wasn't quite as much of a big deal, in terms of the jury's thought process. So realistically, it should have always just been Tommy and Lauren going in to go against the bigger threats. But Tommy is able to so easily manipulate Nora, and not even just that, is able to instigate a clear fight between them, causing more turmoil for whenever she would go into the jury. And Nora, unlike even some of the people I have higher up here, had no winning chances. She didn't have any real win equity, which is what makes her so hard to put really that highly, because she was just never going to make it that far and never really stood a chance at winning the game. I do respect Nora for how active she was trying to be and how much she was trying to play the game, but just as honestly as I can be about it, it was never going to lead to a win and was never going to really get her that far, so it's shocking that she made it to Final Tribal, but that was all just due to the fact of her being a GOAT, which leads her at number 4. And now at number 3, I talked about this player earlier. It's Susie from Survivor Capone. Susie's awful. Susie is never properly in the majority. She's technically voting correctly at the start, but that's to get out general consensus targets. Throughout the post-swap, she is the target initially over Dan, but they just ultimately decide Dan's going to be a bigger threat. And then the first note of how bad and actively bad Susie's going to be, she tells Corinne that she was going to vote Corinne out. And mind you, this is Gabon, so like, duh. But why? You are blatantly the opposing alliance's secondary target. If Dan were to have an idol, they would vote you out. So why would you ever even consider telling them that you were targeting them? It's so dumb. And then I give her credit. Susie's one legitimately very good move in the post-swap is voting out Marcus. Marcus, this player who was poised to win the game, was literally one challenge away, I feel, away from just dominating the game in near Kim Spradlin-esque fashion, is taken out by Susie Smith. And it's not even really due to anything that Susie's like overtly impressive with. It mostly just boils down to the fact that Susie's not that big a threat and is able to get picked up as a number very quickly for this new alliance, in which she's able to coast her way through the game, but as such has zero win equity, and most people don't even like her. And an understatedly bad move, this might be a bit of a stretch, is her actively picking a fight with Randy after the auction. This has been said by Randy actively cost Susie the game. How she ended up taking the cookie situation, which, mind you, is fucking ridiculous. However, it's Survivor Gabon, so, like, who cares? And because of how she treated Randy in this scenario, she loses Randy's jury vote in a situation where she was very apt to get it. It was going to be her or Bob, and, like, it was really a coin toss. And then she just kept, like, sticking it in the mud to Randy, as such causing him to be so bitter that he votes for Bob over her, which is terrible. And then another thing is, at the Final Four, she was gonna be the primary target. She is quite literally one of the biggest GOATs in Survivor history on paper. And yet, she was gonna be the consensus target at Final Four for no reason. She ends up winning final immunity, sides with Maddie, which doesn't even end up being the right side, as Bob wins a fire-making challenge, which, like, that is what it is, but... And then Susie gets the final tribal, in which she stumbles her way into getting 3 jury votes, but she was never going to get the 4th one because of how she burned Randy. Susie is a player that had zero real agency throughout the game. She was never properly going to do anything to get to the end, and more than anything else, just didn't have any real winner prospects, which leads her here at number 3. And the only reason why she's at number 3 is she's technically in the majority throughout the post-merge, but she's such a non-factor within that. These top 2, I think, are pretty definitively the bottom 2. They're coming from fairly recent seasons, all things considered. At number 2, I have Jake. I really like Jake. Same thing with Owen. I wanted Jake to play a better game, but Jake's game is pretty horrible. And I can just sum it up like this. He was never in a proper majority alliance throughout the entire game. he's never once in a spot to where he's able to dictate a vote, he's able to get anything going without some type of advantage. He's really being dragged through the game just because of how much of a non-factor he is. And he's trying. He's doing so much. It's similar to Nora in that regard. He wants to get things going. He tries to save Caleb at the split vote. It doesn't happen. He tries to get Dee out at Final 5. It doesn't happen. He tries to form a relationship with Bruce and make it further with him. It doesn't happen. Just everything that Jake tried to do across the season consistently failed. And in a sense, I feel like that almost makes it worse. Because at least with Susie, she was passive and she wasn't like trying to make these big moves half the time. Jake is trying to make these moves, which should be pointing a bigger target on his back, but he's such a non factor that he's not able to do anything. He was going to be the target at the Kelly boot. They ultimately flipped it because Kelly was just a bigger threat. They got out Kendra because Kendra was one of the only eligible votes there. He was gonna be the target had Bruce played his idol. He would have been taken out there and is only saved by the merit of Bruce not playing his idol. And even beyond that, in the end game, it's just simply people thinking, oh, we can pick him up as an easy vote to get out Drew, or oh, I'm gonna help vote out Julie, in which the Julie plan was never going through. Jake was somebody who was just always poised to just never win the game. It's a miracle he even gets to the end, considering the only thing he really does right across his entire game is winning fire making. I like Jake. I want to put Jake higher, but Jake is just a really honestly bad player on this season. That's why he's number 2. And number 1, this might get me in some hot water. I know some people defend this person's game, but I simply can't justify this person not being the worst finalist in all of Survivor history. At number 1, I have Natalie Anderson from Survivor Winners at War. And Natalie Anderson is very distinct in this. She's the only player on this list to have been voted out and came back into the game. I didn't put Chris Underwood. I didn't put Lil on this list. I wanted to sort of forego the if you were voted out first. I mean, if you were voted out, you don't make the list. I think it just simply makes for things being less interesting. But even within that, I think I had to put Natalie at the bottom. For one thing, I will say this. Natalie's kind of screwed on her initial tribe. She was always the type of player that was a big enough threat, but not a big enough shield to want to keep in a season like Winners at War. And with her pre-built-in connection with Jeremy on that tribe, it makes sense why Natalie Anderson was the person eliminated there. However, she still played really badly. Her first round of gameplay still isn't solid. She's not making enough social bonds and being able to bring people in to make them want to keep her, which ultimately leads to her vote. And even within that, it's like she was always going to be the vote out, but it could have been a lot better than what ended up happening. And even within that, whenever she does return, this is the biggest fault. You should recognize the season aired after Edge of Extinction. Natalie Anderson had a clear blueprint for what she needed to do to win the game, which is what Chris Underwood did, and she was going to be able to do it. She had the same resources and allies in Michelle. However, she just doesn't make a move. She plays an idol at 6. It ends up going down to no votes. She's saved via that. At Final 5, it was her and Michelle needing an idol. She misreads it and ends up playing her idol on herself when Michelle needed it more so. Even then, though, Sarah flipped to vote out Ben, but in a sense, that was done because Ben quit the game. And then at Final 4, Natalie wins final immunity in a spot where she needed to go to fire making to have a chance. But no, she keeps it, saves Michelle, and puts Tony and Sarah in fire making, in which she gives Tony a clear spot to make the jury root for him, and ends up winning and demolishes her in a jury vote. In the biggest jury vote in all of Survivor history. Ultimately, what ends up happening is Tony beats her by a 12-4 vote. There were 16 jurors, and Natalie Anderson got 4 of them. And even then, when you look at the 4 people that voted for Natalie Anderson, it's not even impressive. The votes for Natalie Anderson were Parvati Shallow, who I give credit was a very big defender of Natalie and was a strong ally of hers on the edge. That's good. Ethan, who had a bad relationship with Michelle and never met Tony. Jeremy, duh, and Tyson, who I'm honestly not sure why Tyson votes there, but still, every other vote is lost, and a lot of them are due to actively bad relationships she made on the edge. Notably, Yule has talked in postseason how Natalie Anderson treated her horribly on the island, and it's just you had a clear blueprint on what you could have done to better yourself in the season, on what she should have done to win the game. But Natalie Anderson fumbles the ball at every moment. There's a reason why certain people looked at Natalie Anderson as one of the best Survivor players of all time. Because she was this big threat. Because she was able to take risks and major moves. But however, on Winners at War, she does none of those. And as such, ruins her legacy and cements her on this list as the worst finalist in Survivor history. With that being said, though, that was my bottom 10 finalists in Survivor history. Feel free to put your lists down below, say what you agree with, disagree with. And with that being said, I really hope that you enjoyed and you have a good one.